Hey, this is Mr. Mitchell with another science video. We do not have any questions with this video either. You do need to do just like you did last time. Write down 5 questions and answers that come from this video to show to me or somebody else who is in class with you. Let's talk about cell permeability. We talked about organic compounds in the cell. Now let's see what gets in the cell and what doesn't get in the cell. Cells have structures that protect themselves from the world outside. So if you have a cell that is in your body that has the little nucleus here and has all the other organelles in it, the cell membrane that is on the outside doesn't allow everything to come in, but it does allow some things to come in. The cell membrane in that case is called selectively permeable. Permeable means allows things in and out, and selectively, of course, means that it selects things to allow in and out. Some substances are allowed to pass, some are not. Some of the ones that are allowed to pass are oxygen, food, and I find myself writing really slowly, but I'll get there, and water. I'll just put that as W because, wow, I have written a lot already. Oxygen, food, and water are some things that are allowed in living cells, which all living things are made up of cells anyway. Those are things that are allowed to pass. Now, in this particular video, we're going to talk about 3 ways in which those things are allowed to pass. One way is diffusion. Diffusion means a movement of an area from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Now, let's take a look at these examples here. Let's say we have a membrane here. Let's say this is the cell membrane. If you have, say, substances with a lot of water with a lot of nutrients in here, and that means you don't have many nutrients inside the cell membrane, what's going to happen is it's just going to naturally disperse out. Diffusion is what that's called. And what's going to end up happening is something that looks just like this. It's kind of like taking a bowl of Cheerios. If you had a bowl of Cheerios and had a divider between one side of the bowl and the other, what happens when you lift that divider? The Cheerios will end up spreading out toward the whole amount of area that it has. Just like if you were to open a bottle of, well, let's say there's a guy with stinky feet in the back of the classroom. He takes off his shoes. That stink is going to disperse out amongst the whole classroom. Now, the reason why this happens is because molecules are always moving. It happens in the air, it happens in the cells. They're always moving and they're bumping into each other. And what happens when it's moving and bumping into each other, this spreads the substances out across the area where everything's located. So oxygen is spread this way inside the cells. You have cells that need oxygen. If oxygen is outside the cells, it will disperse in. Whenever we breathe in and take in oxygen, that oxygen can get into our cells because we have filled the areas around the cells with oxygen, and it will creep into the cells. Now, the cell does not have to exert any energy in diffusion. Now, osmosis is a kind of diffusion, but they have it listed here because it is so common. Osmosis specifically is the diffusion of water. The diffusion of water. So, whenever you have diffusion of water, that means cells are getting water when you have more water on the outside of the cell than you do on the inside of the cell. Let's say you have exercised and you are dehydrated. You drink something, it gets water, drink some water, it gets water outside the cells and it quickly kind of goes into the cell and it is spread out once the water gets in there. That is an example of osmosis. Most cells cannot function without water. That makes osmosis very important. An example is red blood cells. Red blood cells, our blood, what we think of as the red part of our blood, are surrounded by salty water. And when osmosis happens and it's surrounded by the salty water, those cells will end up expanding when the salty water gets in. But let's say there's more salty water inside the red blood cell than out, it will kind of shrink a little bit. You may remember that water in the cells is kind of like air in the balloon. If you take the water out of the cell, then you're going to it's just like taking air out of the balloon. So you can have, if you put some substances, say, in your blood, it can either expand the red blood cells, or if the area around it does not have what the cells have, then it can shrink it. I know that's kind of a heady concept, but just know that osmosis process can expand or shrink the cells that are in your blood, in your lungs, and pretty much anywhere. Let's talk about active transport now. Active transport is a third way that you can have an interchange between what's out of the cell to what's in the cell. Now, while diffusion and osmosis are forms of passive transport, active transport is movement of materials that requires some kind of energy for the cell. It doesn't take any energy for this oxygen or water to go from outside the cell to inside the cell. It's just a natural process. But what happens if you have one side and you have this little dot of whatever this is that needs to get over here? It is kind of like a fish swimming up the stream, against the stream. It's kind of like bicycling uphill instead of downhill. Sure, you can bicycle uphill. It's not as easy, so it's not going to happen as often. Sure, a fish can swim upstream against the current of the other fish, but it happens. And active transport does happen. Now, here's how it happens. It almost always has to do with concentration, just like it was up here. If you have an area that is low concentration going to high, that's an example of when you would need active transport. Now, this is sometimes done by transport proteins, and here's kind of a simple look at transport proteins. Transport proteins, well, I've seen several different figures of how they would look, but here's a simplistic example. A transport protein is attached to the cell membrane. Now what happens is, notice you have more items, you have more of a concentration of these little yellow beads on the inside than on the outside, but this outside molecule is able to get in. And the cell knows what needs to get in there, some kind of nutrient, some kind of something that it needs. So these molecules are able to latch onto this transport little pod, I guess you might say, this transport protein. And it's kind of like an open door, you might say, where you see what happens here. It allows it to go through, but prevents other unwanted things from coming in. And it's kind of like a trap door, maybe a good way to put it as well. This is transport proteins. The protein picks up the item, it carries it into the cell. Another method is called engulfing. Now, engulfing is kind of like an amoeba, you might say. I'm going to draw a crude little cell right here. If you have something that needs to get into the cell, sometimes cells can engulf it. They can kind of, well, it looks like it's just swallowing it. The cell can just kind of connect around it, and this will end up being around and inside the cell because it has engulfed it. And what it does, it forms a little vacuole in there. So that gets whatever substance is out there into the cell. Now, what happens is when the molecule enters the cell, well, this is the reason why cells are small. You know, cells are just incredibly small. We have to look under microscopes just to see them, and this is one of the reasons why. Because anything that gets in the cell, whether it be oxygen, whether it be water, whether it be some kind of nutrient material that has to be engulfed, it generally goes to the nucleus. It generally goes to the nucleus. Now, the nucleus on a little bitty cell, like all our cells, is very close to the outer wall. But if you had a real big cell, kind of like the size of our head, it would be a long time before it would get from the outer part inside to the nucleus. Because it just would. It's not like this is empty space here. You have cytoplasm that's in here that carries the materials in. You have organelles in there. It's just got to be. It has to be closer. So that is why you have cells that are very, very small instead of cells that are very, very large. It just would take a long, long time. Hey, don't forget to write the questions down that you're going to get from here. Remember, you make up the questions and then you bring them and the answers to class. Hope you learned a little bit about cell permeability.